She had been rehearsing those words for 3 days. I'm pregnant, 12 weeks. We're going to have a baby. Simple words. Words that should have saved a marriage. But the moment Naomi Ellison pushed open that executive office door, every carefully rehearsed sentence dissolved into nothing, because Vanessa Hale was sitting on her husband's lap, laughing, one hand resting deliberately on his chest, the other pressing her phone up for a selfie like she owned every inch of that room. Like she owned him. And the worst part? Gavin hadn't even looked up yet. Naomi's fingers tightened around the ultrasound envelope. If you've ever stood in a doorway and felt your entire future collapse in a single second, you already know exactly what she felt in that moment. Stay with me, because this story is about to go places you will not see coming. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now and ring the notification bell. You do not want to miss where this goes. Drop a like and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning had started the way most terrible mornings do, quietly, with no warning at all. Naomi Ellison woke up before the alarm. She lay there in the king-sized bed that had started feeling too large, too cold, too empty on her side even when Gavin was technically in it. He'd come home after midnight again. She'd heard him moving through the hallway, heard the soft click of the guest bathroom door rather than theirs, and she'd stared at the ceiling and told herself it was the acquisition. It was always the acquisition lately. She told herself a lot of things those days. She got up at 5:47, which she remembered precisely because she checked her phone out of habit, and the time burned itself into her memory, the way small details tend to do when they're attached to the worst days of your life. She made coffee she didn't drink. She stood at the kitchen window watching the city below begin its slow morning crawl, and she pressed one hand flat against her stomach. 12 weeks. The ultrasound photo was in a yellow envelope on the counter. She'd picked up the envelope 3 times since getting home from Dr. Patel's office yesterday. Set it down. Picked it up again. She wasn't sure what she was waiting for. The right moment, maybe. The right version of Gavin. The one who used to hold her hand during scary movies and call her from business trips just to hear her voice. Not because he needed anything, just because he did. That version of Gavin had been missing for the better part of a year. She understood pressure. She'd been a paralegal for 11 years before they married, and she knew what it looked like when a person was being consumed by work. She'd watched partners at the firm age a decade in 18 months. She got it. She wasn't naive. But there's a difference between understanding something and surviving it. She picked up the envelope a 4th time, and this time she didn't put it down. Today, she told herself. You tell him today. Whatever's happening with the company, whatever's happening between you two, he needs to know. He deserves to know. And maybe this is the thing. Maybe this is what brings you back to each other. She almost believed it. Gavin's office was on the 43rd floor of the Mercer Dynamics Tower in Midtown. Naomi had been there hundreds of times. She knew the security guards by name, Martin at the front desk, who always asked about her mother's hip surgery, even though the surgery had been 2 years ago, and a newer woman named Courtney, who'd once lent Naomi an umbrella during a surprise October storm. Martin waved her through without checking her bag. Courtney smiled and said, "Mrs. Mercer, good morning." Normal. Ordinary. The kind of morning where nothing prepares you for what's waiting. She took the private elevator, the one that went directly to the executive floor, bypassing the open-plan offices where 100 employees would have noticed her arrival. She took it partly out of habit, and partly because she wanted this to be private, between her and Gavin, not a company event. She got off the elevator and walked past the small cluster of assistants' desks outside Gavin's office. 2 of them glanced up and then looked away quickly in a way that should have registered as odd. It didn't. She was thinking about the words again. I'm pregnant, 12 weeks. She put her hand on the door handle. She pushed it open. Vanessa Hale was 29 years old, built like a woman who understood exactly what she looked like and deployed that understanding the way other people deployed resumes. Strategically, deliberately, always with one eye on the result. She had been Gavin's executive secretary for 14 months. She was excellent at her job. She was also excellent at several other things that had nothing to do with the job description. When the door opened, Vanessa was sitting on Gavin's lap. Her left arm was draped across his shoulders. Her right hand was holding a phone out in selfie mode, and she was laughing at something, head tilted, the kind of performance laugh that looks effortless but takes practice. 2 ties were spread across the desk. Gavin's hands were on them, apparently in the middle of choosing one. But the body language, the positioning, the whole tableau read like something else entirely. It read like intimacy. It read like familiarity. It read like a woman who had been in that chair, in that position, many times before. Outside in the assistant's bay, at least 4 people had a sight line to the open door. Naomi didn't know that then. She didn't know that 2 of them had already started typing. Gavin looked up a beat too late. The smile hadn't fully left his face yet from whatever Vanessa had just said. So the first thing Naomi saw was her husband smiling, with his secretary in his lap, in the private executive office that he'd told her only last week. He didn't want her stopping by unannounced because the team was under enormous stress. He'd used those exact words. Enormous stress. The sound in the room dropped to nothing. Not silence, there was still ambient city noise from the floor-to-ceiling windows. But for Naomi, it went completely silent. The ultrasound envelope in her hand suddenly weighed about 40 pounds. Vanessa moved then. Not quickly, not with guilt. She slid off his lap with the careful, unhurried grace of someone who wanted to be watched doing it. She smoothed her skirt. She reached up and adjusted Gavin's collar, one deliberate motion, fingers touching his jaw briefly. And she smiled at Naomi with a warmth so practiced it was almost insulting. "Mrs. Mercer, I didn't realize you were coming in today." A tiny pause, loaded as a gun. "I'll give you 2 a moment." She picked up both ties. She walked out. She pulled the door almost but not quite all the way closed behind her. What Naomi did next was not what she'd planned. She had planned, in some corner of her mind, to say something dignified, something measured. She was good at that. Controlled emotion, clean words. 11 years of watching lawyers perform under pressure had given her a second layer of self-possession that she called on regularly. She didn't call on it now. She walked to his desk. Not fast. Each step felt deliberate without being deliberate, the way your body sometimes moves on autopilot when your brain has simply stopped processing. She set the yellow envelope down on the desk between them, the stack of papers, the 2 absent ties, his coffee cup, and now this. "I came to tell you something that would have changed our lives." Her voice didn't shake. She was surprised by that. Later, she would not be able to explain where the steadiness came from. Gavin started to speak. "Naomi, that wasn't—" "I know what it looked like," she said. "It didn't look like anything—" "Gavin." She said his name the way you say something when you want it to end a sentence rather than start one. "I know what I saw." She turned around. She walked back to the door. He called her name twice. She heard it. She registered it. She did not stop. She pushed the door open and she walked past the assistants' desks without looking at any of the faces that were very carefully pretending not to look at her. And she pressed the elevator button, and when the doors opened, she stepped inside and watched the polished metal doors close. The ride down took 43 floors. She counted. She didn't cry until she was outside and had turned the corner off the main avenue and found herself in a service alley that smelled like coffee grounds and rain-soaked cardboard. And then she leaned against the wall and let it happen. Fast and ugly, the way grief that has been held too long tends to come out. She pressed her hand against her stomach again. "It's okay," she said to no one, to someone. "We're going to be okay." She wasn't sure she believed that either. Upstairs, Gavin stood at his desk, holding the yellow envelope for 30 seconds before he opened it. He had been calling her name. He'd gone as far as the elevator lobby before the doors closed, and he'd stood there with his hand not quite on the call button, paralyzed by the certainty that whatever he said in that hallway with 4 employees watching from their desks was going to make this worse. He'd turned around. He'd gone back to his office and picked up his phone and called her. She didn't answer. He called again. Voicemail. He looked at the envelope. It was yellow, the cheerful yellow of greeting cards and spring flowers, and it had no writing on the outside. And something about that, the blankness of it, the nothingness of a sealed envelope with no address, no name, just a plain yellow rectangle, made his stomach drop before he touched it. He opened it. The ultrasound picture was small, grainy in the way those pictures always are, gray and white and hard to read if you don't know what you're looking for. But printed below the image were the clinical details in clean black type. Patient name. Date. Gestational age. 12 weeks. Gavin Mercer had made a billion-dollar company by being able to assess information quickly and accurately, by understanding what data meant before other people finished reading it. He sat down. He read the printout. He read it again. He set it down and pressed both hands flat on his desk and stared at the far wall. His wife had come to tell him she was pregnant. She had come to tell him the most important thing either of them would ever hear, and she had walked in the door and she had seen... He pushed back from the desk. He knocked over his coffee cup. He didn't notice. He called her again. Nothing. Vanessa reappeared 20 minutes later with a revised agenda for his 2 o'clock. She set it on the desk with the practiced efficiency of a woman who'd simply stepped out to give a couple privacy. Nothing more. She noted the overturned coffee cup without comment, righted it, pulled a folded paper towel from somewhere and blotted the spill. She seemed upset, Vanessa said. Matter of fact. Concerned, even. Her face arranged in a version of worry that was credible if you weren't paying close attention. She was, Gavin said. I hope everything's all right at home. A pause. Should I reschedule the 2 o'clock? If you need to leave early? No. He stood up. I need to find my wife. Of course. She nodded, sympathetic, already stepping toward the door. I'll have Martin call you a car. Later, much later, after everything unraveled, Gavin would replay this conversation and understand what he'd missed. The small performance of concern. The way she'd suggested the car instead of simply asking if he needed anything. Little nudges, tiny directions. She'd been steering him like a ship since the moment he hired her, and he'd never felt the hand on the wheel. That afternoon, he felt nothing but panic. He spent 6 hours trying to find his wife. Naomi had turned off location sharing on her phone 8 weeks earlier. She didn't advertise that. It wasn't an act of deception. She'd done it after a conversation with her friend Lena, who had strongly suggested that a woman going through marital strain had the right to exist somewhere without being tracked, even by her own husband, even benignly. It was a small, private thing. It became, that afternoon, enormously significant. By 4 o'clock, Gavin had called her sister, her friend Priya, the apartment building's front desk, and, with some embarrassment, their couple's therapist, Dr. Angela Ross, who could not share anything but confirmed gently that she had not heard from either of them today. Nobody knew where Naomi was. She was, in fact, on a train. She'd gone back to the apartment first. She'd moved through it quickly, mechanically, pulling things from drawers and shelves with the efficient numbness of someone whose body was executing a plan that her mind hadn't fully authorized yet. Enough for a week, maybe 2. She had a credit card in her maiden name she'd never closed, not for any suspicious reason, just because she'd never gotten around to it, and she used that at the ticket counter instead of her phone. She didn't know she was being methodical. She didn't think of it as fleeing. She thought of it as needing air. She sat in the window seat and watched the city give way to the loose, scattered development at its edges, and then to actual open land, flat and gray-green under October sky, and she pressed her forehead against the glass and thought, I have to figure out what I'm doing. She had a person to take care of now. A small, 12-week, walnut-sized person who had no idea that the world they were coming into had just tilted sideways. She would figure it out. She had to. Back in the city, the thing that Naomi didn't know, the thing that would take weeks to fully surface, had already started moving. Within 2 hours of the office incident, a version of events was circulating on the executive floor that Naomi couldn't have written because she hadn't been there to witness its spread. She'd seen one moment. What was growing in her absence was an entire narrative. Vanessa hadn't said much. She was careful about that. What she'd done was allow certain silences to exist, pauses where a denial might have been, small expressions of something like regret when colleagues asked if everything was okay. She'd mentioned once, quietly, to the head of HR administration that she hoped the situation with Mrs. Mercer wouldn't affect the team. She'd said it with such restrained professionalism that the HR administrator had told 3 people before dinner. By the next morning, the story had a shape. Gavin Mercer was having an affair with his executive secretary. His wife had walked in and caught them. She'd left the building in tears. The story wasn't true. But it was close enough to the image people had seen, the doorway, Vanessa's position, the obvious distress on Naomi's face as she passed the desks, that very few people bothered to question the distance between what they'd actually witnessed and what they were now repeating. By noon, it had reached 2 board members. By 3 o'clock, a financial journalist who had a source inside Mercer Dynamics had made 3 calls. Gavin didn't know any of this yet. He was still trying to find his wife. He found the ultrasound picture on his desk that evening when everyone else had gone home. He'd actually misplaced it in the chaos of the afternoon. It had slid under a folder during his frantic departure. And when he picked it up again in the quiet office, the city lights making the windows into mirrors, something in him that had been running on pure adrenaline for 8 hours simply stopped. He sat in his chair. The same chair. The one where this morning he'd been reviewing acquisition financials with Vanessa leaning over his shoulder, explaining a liability column she'd highlighted, and she'd said something about the broken wheel on the guest chair and sat down sideways on the arm of his chair, and he'd been looking at the document and half listening to her, and he had not thought about what it looked like because he'd been looking at a liability column. That was the truth of it. That was the miserable, ordinary, devastating truth of it. He thought about how many moments had looked like something else, how many times she'd adjusted his tie before a camera, how many times she'd found a reason to stand close. He'd registered all of it as professional familiarity, the kind of comfortable working relationship that develops with a good executive assistant. He'd told himself the closeness was efficient, not personal. I thought about Naomi calling 3 weeks ago to say she wanted to have dinner, and could he please not cancel this time? And he'd said, of course. And then at 6:15, Vanessa had walked in with a crisis, a regulatory filing that needed his attention immediately. And he'd called Naomi to reschedule, and she'd answered on the first ring, and the sound of her voice when she said, okay, that's fine, had been so flat, so exhausted, that he'd almost said forget the filing. Almost. He held the ultrasound picture and stared at it until the city lights blurred. He had done this. Not what Vanessa had done, whatever that was, whatever was growing, but his own version. The steady, boring, catastrophic neglect of the person he had promised to show up for. And now she was gone, and she was carrying his child, and he didn't know where she was. And it was dark outside, and his phone kept ringing with numbers he didn't recognize. And tomorrow the board was meeting, and somewhere in a train seat, or a friend's spare bedroom, or a hotel room in a city he couldn't name, his wife was alone. He put the ultrasound picture in his jacket pocket. He picked up his phone. He called her one more time. It rang 6 times. Then it went to voicemail. He didn't leave a message. He sat in the silence of his office that suddenly felt less like power and more like a room he'd managed to empty of everything that mattered, and he thought, I don't know who I've become, but I know I have to find her before I figure out the rest. He didn't know yet what finding her would cost him. He didn't know yet what had been done to them. He only knew that the photograph in his pocket was the most important thing he owned, and that somewhere the woman who had brought it to him was trying to decide whether he was worth coming back to. He wasn't sure yet that the answer was yes, but he was going to spend whatever he had left making the case. Gavin didn't sleep that night, not even close. He sat at the kitchen table until 2 in the morning with his laptop open and his phone face up beside it and a glass of water he'd poured and never touched. The apartment felt wrong in a way that was hard to name. Not empty exactly, because Naomi hadn't taken everything. Her things were still there. Her jacket was still hanging by the door. Her reading glasses were still folded on the nightstand, but absent. Like the air itself had noticed she was gone and hadn't figured out what to do about it. He kept refreshing his email. He didn't know what he was waiting for. At 2:17, a text came in from a number he didn't recognize. No greeting, no name. Just a link to a gossip finance blog he'd never heard of, and 3 words above it, you should see. He clicked it. The headline was not subtle. Mercer Dynamics CEO in office affair. Wife walks in on secretary encounter. There was a photograph. It was taken from outside the office door, angled through the gap, and it was just clear enough to be devastating. Vanessa in his chair, her arm around his shoulders, his face in profile turned slightly, with that half-fading smile that had still been on his face when Naomi came through the door. The caption read, Sources inside Mercer Dynamics confirm an ongoing relationship between CEO Gavin Mercer and Executive Secretary Vanessa Hale, Mrs. Mercer reportedly discovered the pair during a surprise visit to the executive floor yesterday morning and left the building in visible distress. He read it 3 times. Then he did something he almost never did. He called his head of communications, Dana Chu, at 2:30 in the morning. She picked up on the second ring, which meant she'd already seen it. Tell me it's not from our people, he said. I can't tell you that yet, Dana said. Her voice was flat and careful the way voices get when someone is choosing every word. The photo had to come from inside the building. The angle is from the assistant bay. Who had a phone out? Gavin, half those people have their phones out constantly. You know that. Who sent it to the blog? A pause. We're working on it, He pressed two fingers against his forehead. What's the play? Right now? Nothing. You say nothing. Any statement before we know the full shape of this makes it worse. Another pause. Longer. Is there anything I need to know before I go to the board tomorrow? He closed his eyes. Nothing happened, Dana. I believe you, she said, with the measured neutrality of someone who is professionally obligated to believe him and personally undecided. Get some sleep. He didn't get any sleep. The board meeting started at 9. Gavin arrived at 8:45. He'd showered, changed, done everything a person does to perform functionality when they feel none. He had the ultrasound photo in his inside jacket pocket again. He didn't know why he kept putting it there. It wasn't a rational decision. The boardroom was on the 44th floor, one above his office, with a long oval table and a wall of windows that looked east over the city. 7 board members. Gavin had worked with most of them for years. He knew which ones liked him and which ones tolerated him and which ones had been waiting, quietly, for an opening. Victor Haynes was the last category. 61 years old money background, a way of speaking that managed to be polite and contemptuous simultaneously. He arrived last, as usual, and took his seat at the far end of the table and poured himself water and said nothing until the room had settled. Then, I assume we're all aware of the situation. We're going to address it, Gavin said. Good. How? By clarifying the facts. What was reported is not. What was photographed, Victor said, is what people are responding to. The reporting is secondary. The photograph doesn't show what people think it shows. What does it show then? Victor folded his hands on the table. He asked it plainly, without heat, which was somehow worse than if he'd been aggressive. Because what it shows to me, and I've looked at it carefully, is your secretary in your lap in your private office. And what it shows after that is your wife leaving the building in distress. He paused. Correct me if I'm missing something. Gavin looked at him steadily. You're missing context. Context. Victor let the words sit there. Vanessa was explaining a document. The guest chair had a broken wheel. What you're looking at is 30 seconds of an entirely professional interaction that has been photographed from the worst possible angle and sold to a tabloid blog. The room was quiet. And your wife? This from Eleanor Marsh, who sat 2 seats from Gavin's left and usually stayed neutral until she had reason not to. She was looking at him with something that wasn't quite suspicion, but wasn't sympathy either. My wife came in at a bad moment, Gavin said. We haven't had a chance to talk. He stopped. He wasn't going to say she's gone, and he wasn't going to say, I don't know where she is. We're dealing with it privately. The market's going to open in 45 minutes, Victor said. By 9:30, this is going to be in the financial press. Mercer Dynamics is already trending, which is a sentence I would prefer never to say at a board meeting. He picked up his water glass, set it down without drinking. We need a statement. Dana's drafting one. Dana's statement needs to be bulletproof. Victor leaned forward slightly. Gavin, I need to ask you directly, in this room, with everyone present, is there anything between you and your secretary beyond a professional relationship? Gavin met his eyes. No, he said. There is not. Victor held the eye contact for a full 3 seconds. All right, he said, and sat back. Then let's get to work. Vanessa arrived at the office at 8:59, which was 1 minute before her scheduled start time, and therefore, technically, slightly early. She wore dark gray today, conservative, professional. She had her hair pulled back. She looked like a woman who understood the gravity of the situation and was responding to it appropriately. She stopped at the HR administrator's desk on her way to the executive floor and asked, in a quiet voice, whether there was a protocol for situations like this, whether she should perhaps work from another floor for the day to avoid any appearance of impropriety. The HR administrator, whose name was Sandra, said she'd check with legal. Vanessa nodded gratefully. She touched Sandra's arm briefly, a small gesture of thanks. I just don't want to make things harder for anyone, she said, especially Gavin. She said his first name the way people say the first name of someone they know well. She didn't emphasize it. She didn't need to. Sandra mentioned it to 2 people before the elevator reached 43. The communication statement went out at 10:15. It was 8 sentences long and said nothing, which is the art form of crisis PR. Maximum word count, minimum information. It confirmed that the photograph in question showed an internal business meeting. It described the relationship between Mr. Mercer and all staff as strictly professional. It wished the family privacy during a personal period. The financial press tore it apart within 20 minutes. By 11, the stock had dropped 4%. By 12:30, a second photograph had appeared. This one older, from what looked like 3 months ago, taken at a company event. Vanessa and Gavin standing close at what appeared to be a dinner, his hand briefly on her back in what was likely a going through a doorway gesture, but which photographed as something warmer. Someone had been collecting. Someone had been patient. Gavin saw it at 12:47, sitting in his office, eating nothing and staring at his phone, and he felt the specific cold clarity of a man who understands he has been set up without yet understanding by whom. He called Dana. Where did the second one come from? Same blog, different source, they're claiming. That's not a coincidence. No, Dana said. It's not. I need the security team to pull every piece of internal footage from the past 3 months. Every camera on 43. Every common area she's been in. A short pause. That's going to look... I know what it's going to look like. Do it anyway. He called Naomi 17 times that day. She didn't pick up. He sent 4 texts, each one shorter than the last, because he kept deleting the longer versions, the ones that tried to explain too much. The final one, sent at 4 in the afternoon, said only, I need you to know the truth. Please call me when you're ready. I'm not stopping. She read it. He could see the read receipt. She didn't respond. He stared at the 2 gray check marks for a long time. The security review took 2 days. The team Gavin pulled together was internal. His head of security, Marcus Webb, and 2 analysts from IT. And they started with the 43rd floor cameras and worked backward through 90 days of footage. What they found in the first 6 hours was enough to make Marcus knock on Gavin's door at 8 in the evening with a look on his face that was not quite fear but was adjacent to it. You need to see something, Marcus said. He set a laptop on the desk and pulled up a time-stamped clip from 6 weeks ago. The camera in the eastern hallway of the executive floor, which covered the stretch between the elevator bank and the assistant bay. The timestamp reads 7:12 a.m., early enough that the floor was nearly empty. Naomi appeared in the frame. She was carrying coffee, 2 cups, the way she sometimes brought him coffee when she was passing through Midtown and felt like it. She was walking toward the office. The hallway was quiet. She stopped outside the door and raised her hand to knock. Vanessa appeared from the side. She must have come from the small supply room that branched off the hall because she came in from the left, stepping into the frame at 7:13:08. She said something. They couldn't hear it. The hallway cameras didn't have audio. But it was brief. Naomi's posture changed. She lowered the hand she'd raised to knock. She looked at Vanessa for a moment. She nodded slowly. And then she turned around and left. Gavin watched it twice. What did she say to her, he said. We don't know, Marcus said. No audio on that unit. Can we see Naomi's face when she turns? Marcus scrubbed the clip. Naomi turning away from the door, heading back toward the elevator. Her face was visible for about 2 seconds before she turned the corner. She looked like a person who had been told something she already suspected was true. She'd brought him coffee. And Vanessa had sent her away. Gavin put both hands flat on the desk. Keep going, he said. They kept going. What emerged over the following 36 hours was not a pattern so much as an architecture. Someone had been building something, carefully, methodically, over months. In week 1 of the review, they found 4 incidents of camera angles altered, not dramatically, not in ways that set off any alarms, but shifted slightly, the kind of micro-adjustment that required physical access to the mount. 2 of those shifts happened to eliminate the coverage zone immediately outside Gavin's office door, which meant there was a roughly 3-week window where anyone standing in that spot was not on any recorded footage. In week 2, they found deleted calendar entries. Dinner reservations that had been confirmed and then canceled, always from Gavin's account, always with a brief note about scheduling conflict, on 6 occasions when Naomi had told him she wanted to try to reconnect. He had no memory of canceling any of them. He'd assumed on the nights in question that something came up at work and he'd stayed late. That was not unusual. He hadn't thought to verify whether he'd been the one to make that decision. In week 3, Marcus found the intercepted messages. They came through Naomi's account. She'd had her personal email linked to a shared calendar system when Gavin's team set it up 2 years ago for scheduling purposes, a convenience that now looked like something else entirely. 6 messages from Naomi over the past 4 months sent to Gavin's work address, never received. They existed in the sent records on her side. They didn't exist anywhere in his inbox, his spam, his deleted folder. They had been caught somewhere in between. One was from 3 months ago. It said, "Can we talk tonight? Not about anything heavy. I just miss you. That's all." Gavin read it standing up and had to sit down. Marcus stood across the desk and said nothing. He had the sense to say nothing. "How?" Gavin said. Just the one word. "We're still tracing the pathway," Marcus said. "But someone with high-level admin access to the mail server made configuration changes about 5 months ago, filtering rules that we've never seen set up on any other account." "Who made those changes?" Marcus opened his mouth, closed it. The look on his face was the look of a man who did not want to deliver the next sentence. "The changes were made from credentials registered to your account." Gavin went very still. "My account?" "Yes." "I didn't make those changes." "No," Marcus said carefully. "I know." "Which means someone used my credentials, or had access to a system that accepted equivalent authority." Marcus paused. "I need to bring in someone outside the company to finish this. I trust my team, but what we're looking at now is above what we have scope to evaluate internally. If someone at this level has had system access, I can't verify the integrity of anything using our own infrastructure." Gavin looked at him for a long time. "Who do you trust?" Marcus gave him a name. A firm. Cybersecurity, independent. The kind of outfit that did not advertise. "They're expensive," Marcus said. "I don't care," Gavin said. "Get them in here tomorrow." That night, he drove to the apartment, sat in the parking structure for 20 minutes without getting out of the car, then went upstairs. He walked through the room slowly. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. He ended up in the kitchen where the yellow envelope had been that morning, the morning before everything, and he stood at the counter and thought about 12 weeks and missed dinners in a hallway on the executive floor at 7 in the morning where his wife had turned around and walked away from a door she'd been about to knock on. He thought about how many times she must have tried. In small ways. The ways people try when they're not yet willing to say, "I'm losing you," but are quietly, desperately trying to close the distance before they have to say it out loud. He picked up his phone and called her sister, Brenda. Brenda answered and said, "I can't tell you where she is, Gavin." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking. I just need you to tell her something." A long pause. "She told me what happened. What she saw happened. What she thinks happened didn't." "Gavin, I know how that sounds. I know." He pressed the back of his hand against his mouth for a second. "Tell her I found the emails. The ones she sent me that I never answered. Tell her I know why I didn't answer them, and it wasn't what she thinks. Tell her I'm not going to stop. And tell her—" He stopped. He tried to find the sentence. "Tell her I found the picture. I have it with me. Tell her I understand what she brought me that morning, and I'm sorry I wasn't ready for it." Silence on the line. "That's all," he said. "She doesn't have to call. She doesn't have to do anything. I just need her to know." Brenda said, in a voice that was quieter than it had been. "I'll tell her." He thanked her. He hung up. He stayed in the kitchen for another hour in the dark. The cybersecurity firm arrived the following morning. 2 people, both quiet, both carrying equipment in cases that looked medical, the way serious technical hardware sometimes does. Their lead was a woman named Petra Voss, who shook Gavin's hand once and then didn't speak to him directly again for almost 8 hours, which he found, strangely, reassuring. She wasn't performing, she was working. By 3 in the afternoon, Petra knocked on his door and asked if she could close it. She sat down and put a tablet on his desk and turned it to face him. "In the last 6 months," she said without preamble, "someone with recurring administrative access to your company's communications infrastructure has been running what I would characterize as a sustained interference operation." She said it the way you say something clinical when the non-clinical version would be too loud for an office. "I'm going to show you what we found, and then I'm going to tell you what I think. And I need you to understand that what I think is preliminary. Show me." She showed him. The deleted messages were the least of it. There were altered calendar entries, 6 confirmed, possibly more. There were 2 instances of what appeared to be outbound messages sent from his account that he had no memory of sending, both to Naomi, both cold in tone, one that appeared to decline a dinner request with a terseness that did not sound like him. He read them twice and felt his stomach turn over. She'd received those. She'd received something that looked like him not wanting to come home, and she'd responded with, "Okay, no problem," and he'd never seen either email, never sent the first one, never known the exchange existed. "She thought I was brushing her off," he said. Petra didn't answer. She wasn't there to assess the marriage. "Who?" he said. "Someone with recurring access to your account or to a system that could spoof it," she said again. "The access pattern is consistent. Same time windows, same operational behavior. Late evenings, mostly, after the executive floor empties." He didn't have to ask who had access to the executive floor after it emptied. He didn't have to ask whose job involved staying late, reviewing schedules, handling his accounts. He already knew. But knowing and proving were different continents, and Petra was about to explain that the distance between them was significant, and that someone had been very careful, and that careful people were usually careful for a reason, and that the reason usually involved a destination, and that the destination, whatever it was, had not yet been reached. "There's something else," Petra said. She turned the tablet again. A financial document, partially redacted, column headers he recognized from the acquisition filing. Numbers that were not the numbers he had approved. His eyes moved to the date stamp at the bottom of the document. It was 2 weeks from now. "Where did you find this?" he said. "In a staging directory on your company server," Petra said. "Queued for release." "Release to who?" "The SEC," she said, "and 3 financial journalists." The room went very quiet. "It has your signature on it," Petra said. "Digital signature, authenticated through your credentials. If this goes out as scheduled, it will look like you submitted falsified acquisition financials to a federal body." She paused. "That's not a civil matter." Gavin sat back. He thought about the stock drop. He thought about the board meeting. He thought about the photograph and the second photograph and the blog that had published both. He thought about Naomi on a train somewhere, thinking she'd married a man who had been quietly, carelessly choosing his secretary over his wife for months. He thought about a document queued on a server, 2 weeks from release, bearing his name on fraud that would end his company and put him in front of a federal investigation. Someone had been building a trap. Not just the photograph, not just the rumors, everything, the deleted messages, the canceled dinners, the manufactured distance between him and Naomi, the growing board pressure, the stock instability, all of it was scaffolding, all of it was preparation for this. And his wife was gone, unreachable, alone in some city he couldn't name, carrying his child and believing the worst of him, while whoever had built this thing waited out the clock on a document designed to make sure that when everything finally collapsed, there was nothing left to save. He looked at Petra. "Stop the release," he said. "I can delay it," she said. "I cannot stop it without triggering an alert to whoever is monitoring that directory. If they see interference, they may move the timeline." "How long can you delay without alerting them?" she thought. 72 hours? Maybe a little more. Gavin stood up. 72 hours to find out who had done this, collect enough to prove it, protect his company, and somehow, in the middle of all of it, find his wife before she made a decision about their marriage based on a reality that had been manufactured piece by careful piece by someone who wanted him destroyed. He had 3 days. He didn't have a single one to waste. 72 hours. Gavin wrote it on a piece of paper and put it on the desk in front of him because he needed to see it in physical form. Not on a screen. On paper, in his own handwriting, where it couldn't be deleted or altered by someone with access to his systems. 72 hours. He looked at Petra. "What do you need from me?" "Access to the full server architecture," she said, "and I need your IT director out of the loop." "Why?" "Because until I know who has had access to your administrative systems, everyone with high-level credentials is a potential vector." She said it without apology. "That includes your IT director, your head of communications, and your executive assistant. Vanessa. Among others." Petra picked up the tablet. "I'm not accusing anyone, I'm telling you the methodology." "Fine." He pulled up his phone. "You'll have whatever you need within the hour." She stood. She was already moving toward the door when he said her name. She stopped. "The document on the server," he said. "The one queued for the SEC. If it goes out, it won't," she said. "Not in the next 72 hours. But after that." She looked at him steadily. Then you'd better find who put it there. He called Marcus back in at 9 that evening and closed the door and told him everything Petra had found. Marcus sat across from him without moving for about 30 seconds after Gavin finished, which was a long time for a man who was professionally trained to respond quickly to bad information. Someone built a fraud case against you, Marcus said finally. Someone is building one. Present tense. And it's been in motion for how long? Petra thinks 6 months minimum, possibly longer. Marcus was quiet again. Then, this isn't opportunistic. This isn't somebody who saw a chance and grabbed it. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. This is a campaign. Somebody put money and time and planning into this. I know. That kind of operation doesn't come from inside your company, Gavin. Not from a secretary. The technical sophistication alone... He stopped. Who did you go after in the acquisition? Gavin had been waiting for that question. He'd been circling it himself for the last 2 hours, not wanting to land on it because landing on it meant accepting a scale of opposition that was significantly more frightening than a disgruntled employee or an opportunistic affair rumor. Damian Crosswell made an offer for Mercer Dynamics 8 months ago, Gavin said. I turned it down. Publicly, which I probably shouldn't have done. I said the offer undervalued the company by 40% and that anyone who thought otherwise didn't understand the sector. Marcus looked at him. It was in the journal, Gavin said. I may have used the word amateur. You called Damian Crosswell an amateur in the Wall Street Journal. The quote was taken slightly out of context. Gavin, Marcus pressed 2 fingers against his temple. Crosswell has taken apart 3 companies in the last 4 years. He doesn't sue people. He doesn't argue. He made a gesture with his hand. Dismantles. He just dismantles them. I know who Damian Crosswell is. Do you know that 2 of the CEOs who went up against him ended up under federal investigation? One of them is still in litigation. His company sold at 20 cents on the dollar to a Crosswell subsidiary. The room was quiet. I need you to find the connection, Gavin said, between Crosswell and Vanessa. Whatever it is, money, contracts, prior relationship, find it. If Crosswell is behind this, he's covered his tracks. Then dig until you find what's under the tracks. Marcus nodded once. He stood up. At the door he paused, hand on the frame. Your wife, he said, without turning around. Does she know any of this? No. She needs to, Marcus said. Not because it changes anything legally, because if Crosswell is orchestrating this, and she's out there alone, and he figures out that she matters to you. He stopped himself. He didn't finish it. He didn't need to. Naomi had been in Seaport, a small coastal town 3 hours south, for 4 days. Her college friend Diane had a house there, a narrow 2-story with white paint peeling at the window frames and a kitchen that smelled like coffee and old wood. Diane was a landscape painter who worked odd hours and asked few questions, which was exactly what Naomi needed and exactly why she'd called her instead of anyone else. She slept a lot the first 2 days. Not good sleep, fragmented, restless, the kind where you wake up at 4 a.m. with your heart going too fast and lie in the dark doing arithmetic. Week 12. Week 13 next Tuesday. She had a follow-up appointment with Dr. Patel in the city that she was going to have to reschedule or attend alone or figure out somehow. She ate what Diane put in front of her without tasting it. On the 3rd morning, she sat at the kitchen table with tea she didn't drink and her phone face down on the table and thought clearly, for the first time since the train ride, about what she was actually doing. She wasn't stupid. She knew the difference between leaving and running, and she knew which one this was. She'd left without a plan because having a plan would have required more certainty than she'd had, and the only certainty she'd had in that elevator going down was that she could not be in that building for 1 more second. But certainty had a way of thinning out. She picked up her phone and looked at the texts from Gavin. All 17 missed calls. The 4 texts, each one shorter, and the last one, I need you to know the truth. Please call me when you're ready. I'm not stopping. She looked at it for a long time. Then Brenda's message came in, and she read it 3 times. He found emails you sent. He says he didn't receive them. He says he has your photo with him. He says he understands what you brought him that morning, and he's sorry. He wasn't ready for it. She set the phone down. She pressed both hands flat on the kitchen table, the worn wood warm under her palms, and she thought about 12 weeks of a secret she'd been carrying alone because she'd been waiting for the right moment. for the version of her marriage where telling him felt like joy instead of negotiation. She thought about emails she'd sent that he'd never answered. "Can we talk tonight? I just miss you, that's all." She remembered sending that. She remembered the silence that followed it and what she'd decided that silence meant. What if it meant something else? What if the silence had been manufactured the same way that Office Scene had felt? Staged, deliberate, placed exactly where it would do the most damage. She didn't call him, not yet, but she stopped turning her phone face down. Marcus found the connection at 11:47 on the second night. He knocked on Gavin's office door. Gavin had been sleeping on the office couch, 2 hours at a stretch, unwilling to go back to the apartment where nothing felt right. And when he came in, his face was the face of a man carrying something heavy. He put a folder on the desk. "Vanessa Hale," he said, "worked for a consulting firm called Arlen Strategic Group from 2019 to 2021. Contract work, mostly. Corporate communications, executive support, that kind of thing. The firm dissolved in 2021. And? Arlen Strategic Group had one primary client in its final 18 months of operation." Marcus pointed to the folder. "A holding company called Meridian Capital Advisors." Gavin opened the folder. He looked at the documents inside. Articles of incorporation, board of directors. One name buried in the middle of a list of 7, under a subsidiary company that connected to the holding company through 2 layers of corporate structure. Damien Crosswell. The room felt different after that. Not louder, stiller. "She's worked for him before," Gavin said. "For a company he controlled," Marcus said. "Whether she knew the ultimate client, she knew." Gavin said it without heat, just fact. "She's been in this building for 14 months. She's been inside my calendar, my email, my office. She knew exactly what she was doing from day one." "We can't prove that yet." "We will." He closed the folder. "How close is Petra to the server architecture?" "She says another 12 hours and she'll have a full map of the access pattern. If Vanessa was the entry point for the system interference, there'll be a trace." 12 hours. Gavin looked at his watch. "That still leaves us inside the window." "Just inside," Marcus said. "But Gavin..." He stopped, looked at him directly. "If we're right about Crosswell, and I think we are, then what we're doing right now, pulling server logs, tracing financial connections, he's going to know. Maybe not tonight, but soon. People like Crosswell have eyes in places you don't expect." Gavin looked back at him. "You think we have less than 72 hours?" "I think the clock may not be ours to control," Marcus said. He called Vanessa into his office the next morning at 8. He hadn't slept. He'd changed his shirt, but not much else. He'd spent the pre-dawn hours reviewing everything Petra and Marcus had compiled, reading it the way you read something you need to know perfectly. Not to understand it, but to be able to hold it under pressure without losing any of the detail. Vanessa arrived at 8 on the dot. She was composed. She sat across from him and crossed her legs and folded her hands in her lap and looked at him with the professional attentiveness she always deployed in one-on-one meetings. Patient, helpful, ready. "How are you holding up?" she said, genuine concern in her voice. "The press coverage has been..." "I need you to walk me through something," Gavin said. "Of course." 3 months ago, July 18th, I had a dinner reservation at Aurelio's. 7:30. I canceled it. He watched her face, perfectly still. "Do you remember that?" A small pause. Thoughtful, not defensive. "I remember there was a conflict. One of the Singapore investors needed a call that evening. The time zones. I didn't make that call," Gavin said. A beat. "I'm sorry?" I looked at my phone records. July 18th, 7 to 9 p.m. No outgoing calls, no incoming calls from Singapore. He let that sit there. "I didn't make the call. So why was the dinner canceled?" Something shifted in her face. Just barely. Like a door that moved an inch and then stopped. "There may have been a miscommunication on my end. I might have..." "Vanessa." She went quiet. "How long have you known Damien Crosswell?" She didn't move. Not a muscle. But the quality of her stillness changed. It went from composed to controlled, which are different things. Composed is natural. Controlled is effort. I don't know anyone by that name," she said. "Arlen Strategic Group," Gavin said. 2019 to 2021. You were listed as senior executive support on 3 contracts. The primary client for the final year and a half was a subsidiary of Meridian Capital Advisors. He paused. Crosswell owns Meridian. She looked at him. Her expression was doing something complicated. Reassembling, he thought, deciding what to be. That was a staffing agency placement, she said. I didn't have visibility into who the end clients were. You're very good, Gavin said. I want you to know I actually believe that you're very good at this. The calendar edits, the camera angles, the messages. He watched her. My wife came to the building in July. You were in the hallway. You stopped her outside my door. I often greet Mrs. Mercer. You sent her away. His voice stayed level. She was carrying coffee. She was going to knock. You said something to her, and she left. He leaned forward slightly. What did you tell her? The mask shifted again, and this time what came through wasn't quite as polished. I told her you were in a sensitive meeting, Vanessa said, carefully. That you'd asked not to be disturbed. I wasn't in a meeting at 7 a.m. I made a judgment call. You made a judgment call, he repeated, quietly. 7 times in 4 months. She said nothing. There's a document on my company's server, Gavin said, queued for release to the SEC. It carries my digital signature and it contains falsified acquisition financials. Would you know anything about that? The silence this time was longer. And in it, something changed. He watched it happen, watched the calculation run behind her eyes, the assessment of what he knew versus what he could prove, the rapid professional triage of someone who was very smart and had just realized that the ground she was standing on was not as solid as she'd believed. I think, she said with great evenness, that this conversation requires legal representation. Yes, he said, it does. She stood. She picked up her bag. She was composed again, the mask fully reseated. And she walked to the door and he watched her and he said nothing else. And she pulled the door open and stepped out, and he heard her heels on the floor moving toward the elevator. And then he picked up his phone and called Petra. She's leaving the building, he said. Are we ready to move the documentation to external storage? Already done, Petra said. 40 minutes ago. Good. He exhaled. She's going to make a call in the next 10 minutes. To someone. We can't monitor her personal... I know. I'm not asking you to. He looked at the door. I'm just telling you the clock just got shorter. I was right. He didn't know exactly when Vanessa made the call, or what was said, or how Damian Crosswell received the information that his operation inside Mercer Dynamics had been compromised. He didn't know the specific conversation. He never would. What he knew was that at 2:17 that afternoon, Petra called him and said the staging directory on the server had been accessed remotely, and the document queued for the SEC had been moved. Moved where? He said. Forwarded, she said. Early. The transmission went out 40 minutes ago. Gavin stood very still in the middle of his office. To the SEC? To the SEC and to the Financial Times, the Journal, and 2 wire services. A pause. I'm sorry. They moved faster than... How long before it's public? It may already... He heard her typing. A pause. It's already on the wire. Financial Times published 4 minutes ago. He sat down. The chair caught him. He thought about the board. He thought about the stock. He thought about the word fraud in a headline next to his company's name, next to his name, with a document that bore his digital signature and contained numbers he'd never approved, and a submission timestamp that predated this morning and therefore predated anything he might say in his defense. He thought about Naomi in a coastal town somewhere, who was going to see this on her phone and what she was going to think. His phone started ringing. Dana. He let it ring. Then Victor Haynes. He let it ring. Then a number he didn't recognize, and some instinct made him answer. The voice on the other end was smooth, unhurried, the voice of a man who had made this call before. Gavin, Damian Crosswell said, I think it's time we talked about your options. Gavin didn't speak for a moment. He looked at the window. The city below, ordinary and indifferent, going about its afternoon. I'm listening, he said. Good. Crosswell let a beat pass. Comfortable silence, the kind that belongs to the person who isn't afraid of it. You're going to have federal investigators at your door by end of business. Your stock is going to drop another 12% before close. Your board is going to call an emergency session by tomorrow morning, And Victor Haynes has already spoken to 2 members about an interim leadership structure. Another pause. I know all of this because I've been watching your company for 8 months. I know its pressure points. I know its people. His voice stayed easy, conversational, the way a man speaks when he is describing something that has already happened and not something that might. I'm prepared to make this go away. What does that mean? It means I have the capability to retract the document, to clarify to the appropriate parties that it was submitted in error. These things happen with complex filings, technical misfires, that's all. The investigation goes nowhere. The story dies. A pause. Your company survives. And what do you get? What I offered 8 months ago, Crosswell said. Full acquisition, fair terms. You stay on as a figurehead for 18 months if you want. We can negotiate that. And then you walk away clean, wealthy, free. His voice dipped slightly, not threatening, just accurate. Or you fight this. And by the time the federal process runs its course, even if you win, which I want you to understand is not a certainty, there will be nothing left worth saving. These things take 3 years, Gavin. Your company won't survive 3 years of this. Gavin pressed the phone against his ear and looked at the city and thought about everything that had been built, carefully, over 8 months. The distance manufactured between him and Naomi, the rumors, the photographs, the forged document, all of it, and understood, finally, the full size of what he was standing inside. This was not a problem he could outwork. This was not a problem he could throw lawyers and PR teams and cybersecurity firms at and expect to win in the normal way, the way he'd won everything else, and the refusal to be outperformed. Crosswell had built a machine designed specifically to exhaust exactly those responses. And somewhere in a small coastal town, Naomi was alone, unprotected. And Damian Crosswell, who had just demonstrated that he was willing to deploy fraud and manipulation and corporate espionage to take apart one company, knew that she existed and knew that she mattered. I need 24 hours, Gavin said. You have until 9 a.m. tomorrow, Crosswell said. After that, I'm afraid the timeline accelerates in ways I won't be able to reverse. The line went dead. Gavin sat without moving for almost a full minute. Then he stood up. He picked up his jacket. He put his phone in his pocket and the ultrasound picture went with it, where it always was now, where it had been every day since Naomi left it on his desk. He walked out of his office past the empty assistant bay. Vanessa's desk cleared in her hasty departure, her monitor dark, her chair pushed back at an angle like she'd stood up quickly and not bothered to straighten it. And he pressed the elevator button and rode down 43 floors and walked through the lobby and out onto the street. He didn't take the company car. He walked. He needed to think, and he needed the cold air and the noise and the indifference of the street, because what he was about to decide was not a business decision and not a legal decision, and could not be made in a boardroom or an executive office or any room that had Mercer Dynamics written on the wall. He had one night. He could take Crosswell's offer and save the company and lose himself, sign over everything he'd built and spend the next 18 months pretending to run it, and then walk away with money that would feel like a bribe every day for the rest of his life. Or he could fight it. With 72 hours reduced to less than 20, with a federal inquiry already forming, with a board that was meeting without him, with a story running in 4 major publications, with a wife he couldn't reach who was somewhere he couldn't name. Or he stopped walking. He was on a side street, quiet, the sound of the avenue muffled behind him. Or he could stop playing the game Crosswell had designed. He pulled out his phone. He called Petra. I need everything you have, he said. Every trace, every access log, every piece of the server architecture, every financial connection between Vanessa Hale and Meridian Capital. Everything. Organized, sourced, defensible. By when? 6 a.m. A pause. I know what it is, he said. Can you do it? Another pause, shorter. Yes. Send it to me and to an attorney named Carol Weston at the Weston firm. I'll clear the authorization. He paused. And Petra, don't send it from your office server. Send it from somewhere clean. Already using a clean line, she said. I've been doing this a long time. He hung up. He kept walking. He called Marcus next. Find out where Crosswell is staying. Not his office, where he is right now, tonight. Marcus stopped. Okay. Why? Because I'm not signing anything, and I'm not running, Gavin said. And I need to know where he is before he knows what I'm doing. He put the phone back in his pocket and kept moving through the cold air, and he thought about Naomi on a train with a yellow envelope and 12 weeks of a secret she'd been waiting to share. And he thought about everything he'd failed to protect, and he felt the fear of it. Not the corporate kind, not the stock price kind, but the real kind, the kind that lives in the chest and doesn't move. And he let himself feel it for exactly half a block. Then he put it somewhere he could carry it without being stopped by it. There was no version of the next 20 hours that didn't require him to become something he hadn't needed to be before. Not a CEO operating in quarterly cycles, not a man managing optics and board relations, but something older and more basic. A person fighting for what was actually his, in the dark, with what he had, against someone who had spent 8 months making sure he had very little left. He thought about Naomi's hand on the door handle of his office, the way she'd walked out without looking back, the steadiness in her voice when she'd said, "I came to tell you something that would have changed our lives." She'd been right. It had changed everything, just not the way either of them had planned. He turned the corner and walked back toward the avenue and started making the calls that would define what remained of the next 20 hours, because Damian Crosswell had given him until 9 a.m. And that was the only clock that mattered now. And somewhere in a coastal town 3 hours south, his wife was reading the news on her phone with his name in the headline. And he had not yet done the one thing that might actually reach her. Not a text, not a message through her sister, but the truth, documented and undeniable, placed directly in her hands before the morning came and took away whatever choices he had left. He flagged down a cab. He gave the driver an address that was not the Mercer Dynamics Tower and not his apartment. It was a car rental agency, open 24 hours, on the west side. He was going to Seaport. The rental car was a gray sedan, anonymous, the kind of car nobody looks at twice on a highway at midnight. Gavin paid cash at the counter, which required showing his license, which meant it wasn't untraceable, but it was the best he had. He threw his jacket in the back seat and got on the highway heading south and called Carol Weston while he was still in the city limits. Carol Weston was 63 years old and had been practicing federal litigation for 37 of those years. She did not have a warm phone manner. She had a precise phone manner, which was better. "Tell me you're not calling me at 11 p.m. to tell me the SEC filing is real," she said. "I'm calling you at 11 p.m. to tell you it's fabricated and I can prove it, and I need you to be at your office at 6 a.m. with a federal contact standing by." A pause. Not a surprised pause. A calculating one. "How solid is your proof?" "Solid enough that I wouldn't be driving 3 hours in a rental car if it wasn't." "Where are you going?" "To get my wife." Another pause, different in quality. "Gavin, your wife is a separate matter from—" "She's not separate," he said. "Nothing is separate. The affair story, the document, the board pressure, it's one operation, and my wife walked into the middle of it without knowing. I need her to have the information before this goes any further." He passed a slow truck on the highway, the headlights catching the reflectors on its trailer. "And I need her somewhere safe." Carol was quiet long enough that he thought he'd lost the signal. Then, "I'll be at the office at 6. Have Petra's documentation to me by 5:30. And Gavin, don't do anything between now and morning that ends up in a police report. I'm going to see my wife." "I meant in general," Carol said. She hung up. He drove for an hour without the radio on. The highway south was mostly trucks at that hour, the occasional pair of headlights coming north in the opposite lanes, and outside the windows, the flat dark of the landscape. And he drove, and he thought, and after about 40 minutes he stopped thinking and just drove, because thinking wasn't producing anything useful, and the road required enough attention that it gave his mind somewhere to rest. His phone buzzed at 12:40. "Marcus." "I found him," Marcus said. "Where?" "Hotel Verano, Midtown. He checked in 2 days ago under a subsidiary company name, but the reservation links back through 3 layers to Crosswell Holdings." A pause. "He's not hiding. He doesn't think he needs to." "He doesn't think he does," Gavin said. "Is he alone?" 2 associates in adjacent rooms, private security, one confirmed, one probable. Marcus paused again. "Gavin, what are you planning to do with this information?" "Nothing tonight. I just needed to know where the center of gravity is." "And tomorrow?" "Tomorrow we give everything to Carol and the federal contacts and we let the legal process work." "And if the legal process doesn't move fast enough?" Gavin didn't answer that immediately. He watched the highway. Then we figure out the next thing, he said, one problem at a time. He hung up and drove the remaining 90 minutes in silence. Seaport at 2 in the morning was exactly what a small coastal town at 2 in the morning is. Dark, cold, quiet, in the specific way of places that empty themselves out in the off-season. He drove through the main street past a closed hardware store and a coffee shop with chairs up on the tables, and a bait-and-tackle place with a handwritten sign in the window. He had Diane's address from a card Naomi had left on the refrigerator years ago, one of those cards you accumulate and don't throw away because you never know. He'd photographed it once, added it to his contacts as Naomi's friend Diane, Beach House, and then never looked at it again for 2 years until tonight, when he'd stood in his kitchen before getting in the car and scrolled through his contacts until he found it. He parked on the street outside. White house, peeling window frames, a porch light on. One window upstairs lit faintly, the blue-white flicker of a phone or a TV. He sat in the car for a moment. I was not a man who was good at showing up without a plan. His entire professional life had been built on preparation. Knowing the room, knowing the numbers, knowing his counterpart's pressure points before he walked through a door. He was sitting outside his wife's temporary refuge at 2 in the morning with a rental car and an ultrasound picture and a folder of evidence that existed only digitally and a federal attorney who wouldn't be at her desk for another 4 hours. He got out of the car. He knocked on the door. It was Diane who answered, not Naomi. She came to the door in a paint-stained sweatshirt and looked at him through the glass panel with an expression that was neither warm nor hostile but carefully neutral, the expression of a woman who had listened to her friend cry for 4 days and had opinions about the person standing on her porch. She opened the door. "She's awake," Diane said. "She was awake when you pulled up." A pause. "I'm going to make coffee, and I'm going to be in the kitchen, and I'm not going to listen, but I want you to know that I'm in the kitchen." "Understood," Gavin said. Diane stepped aside. He went in. Naomi was sitting at the top of the stairs. Not standing, not pacing, not in the living room waiting for him. Sitting on the 3rd step from the top, with her knees drawn up and her arms around them, like she'd come to the top of the stairs and run out of decisions about where to go from there. She was in a gray sweatshirt he recognized, one of his actually, stretched at the collar from years of her wearing it when she was cold. Her hair was loose. She looked tired in a way that wasn't just sleep deprivation. She looked like a person who had been doing a lot of thinking and wasn't done yet. He stood at the bottom of the stairs. They looked at each other. "You drove 3 hours," she said. "Yes." "In the middle of the night?" "Yes." She pressed her lips together. "Not angry. Something more complicated than angry." "The news," she said. "I saw it this afternoon. The SEC filing." "It's fabricated," he said. "I can prove it." She was quiet. Her hands tightened slightly on her own arms. "How bad is it?" "Bad enough that I need to be somewhere tonight doing about 15 other things," he said. "But I'm here instead." Something moved in her face. "Gavin?" "Naomi." He put one hand on the banister. "I need to tell you what happened, not what it looked like. What actually happened. And I need you to let me get through all of it before you say anything, because there's a lot of it, and some of it is my fault, and some of it is not, and I need you to hear the difference." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she moved over on the step, just slightly, making room. He sat down beside her on the stairs. The wood creaked. They were close enough that he could feel the warmth of her shoulder an inch from his, and he did not close that inch because it was not his to close yet. He told her everything. He started with Vanessa and the camera angles, and he worked forward through the deleted messages and the intercepted emails and the calendar entries and the morning in July when she'd brought coffee and Vanessa had sent her away from the door. He told her about Arlen's strategic group and Damian Crosswell and the document on the server and Petra and Marcus and Carol Weston. He told her about the phone call with Crosswell, the offer, the 9 a.m. deadline. He told her about driving here because whatever happened with the company, she needed to know the truth, documented and real, before the morning came. She didn't say anything for a long time after he stopped. The house was quiet. From the kitchen, the soft sounds of Diane moving around, water running, a cabinet opening. "The email," Naomi said. "The one I sent in July. I just miss you." "I never saw it." "I thought—" She stopped. Her voice was careful, controlled, doing the thing he recognized as her holding something back. I thought you read it and chose not to answer. I know. I thought that was you telling me something, she exhaled. That's when I stopped. She stopped again. I just stopped trying as hard. After that. He didn't say anything. There was nothing to say to that wasn't either an excuse or a platitude, and she deserved neither. The baby, she said. I have an appointment on Thursday. I'll be there. Gavin, you may be dealing with a federal inquiry on Thursday. I'll be there, he said again. She turned her head and looked at him. Really looked. The way you look at someone when you're taking inventory of them, rather than just seeing them. You believe you can fix this, she said. I believe I have enough to fight it, he said. That's different. She looked at him a moment longer. Then she looked at her hands. What do you need from me right now? Nothing, he said. Tonight I just needed you to know. She nodded slowly. Then she said, There's a guest room. It's small. That's fine. Don't take it as anything more than what it is. I won't. She stood up. She was 2 steps above him on the staircase, and she paused there for a moment, and she looked down at him and she said, The selfie. On his lap. She was laughing. Her voice was very even. I need you to know that image is in my head every day. He looked up at her. He didn't look away from it. I know, he said. I'm sorry. She nodded once. She went upstairs. He sat on the stairs for another few minutes in the quiet house. Then he went to the guest room and sat on the edge of the narrow bed and opened his phone and began working through the next 4 hours, because the morning was coming regardless of anything else, and Carol Weston needed Petra's documentation by 5:30. He didn't sleep. At 4:15, his phone buzzed with a message from Marcus that made him stand up from the edge of the bed and walk to the window. 2 men. Arrived Seaport 40 minutes ago. Registered at the Anchor Motel under corporate card. Card traces to a shell company 2 layers from Crosswell Holdings. Not confirmed threat. Watching. Gavin stared at the message. Crosswell had found where Naomi was. He didn't know how. He'd been careful. He'd paid cash for the rental. But Crosswell had resources. And Crosswell had been watching for 8 months. And somewhere in Gavin's chain of contacts, a phone call or a search or a credit card swipe had given him enough to trace the direction, if not the exact address. 2 men. 40 minutes ago. He went to Naomi's door and knocked softly. She opened it in 12 seconds, which meant she hadn't been sleeping either. We have a problem, he said. Diane took it with the practicality of a woman who had, in her life, dealt with difficult situations and did not have the patience for anything that wasted time. She listened, standing in the kitchen with her coffee cup, and when Gavin finished, she said, The old Sackler Cannery is 3 blocks east. It's been closed for 8 years. There are 2 ways in and 4 ways out, and I know all of them because I painted there for a winter. She looked at Naomi. You know the one? Naomi said, That's where you want us to go. I want to get you somewhere that isn't a house with 2 bedrooms and 1 door, Diane said. She looked at Gavin. And you? I need to transmit documentation to my attorney and stay on the phone with federal contacts until they can move. He looked at Naomi. I'm not leaving you. You just said you need to. I can do both. He met her eyes. I'm not leaving you. Something in her face changed. Not much. Enough. Diane drove them in her truck, lights off for the first block, because Diane was, it turned out, exactly the kind of person you wanted beside you at 4:30 in the morning in a situation like this. She parked around the back of the cannery and led them in through a side entry she unlocked with a key she kept, she said, out of habit from the painting winter. Inside was vast and cold and dark, the smell of old brine and rust and salt air, the high ceiling lost in shadow, the floor concrete and uneven. Diane produced a flashlight from her coat pocket. She handed it to Naomi. She said, I'm going back to the house. If anyone comes asking, I don't know where you went. She looked at Gavin. You've got a complicated night ahead of you. Yes, he said. Don't let her stand on cold concrete for 3 hours. I won't. Diane left. Gavin found a section of the cannery where old wooden pallets were stacked along the wall, and he made the most functional arrangement possible, which wasn't comfortable but was dry and elevated off the concrete. Naomi sat on it without comment. He sat beside her and opened his laptop. He'd grabbed it from the car and found a cellular signal, weak but present, and connected to Petra's secure share. The documentation was there. All of it. 63 files, organized, time-stamped, sourced. He forwarded it to Carol Weston at 4:47 a.m. Then he called Marcus. "Status," he said, keeping his voice low. "The two men from the motel drove past Diane's address 40 minutes ago. Slow pass, no stop." Marcus paused. "They know approximately where she is. They don't have the exact location yet. How long before they find the cannery? Depends on whether they're canvassing or waiting for instruction." A pause. "If they're waiting for instruction, they'll move when Crosswell gives the order. If the 9 a.m. deadline passes without your agreement, they move," Gavin said. "Yes." He looked at Naomi sitting 3 feet away from him in the dark of an abandoned cannery with a flashlight in her hands, 12 weeks pregnant, in his old stretch sweatshirt, completely calm in a way that cost her something. He could see it costing her. The slight tension in her jaw. The way she held the flashlight with both hands. She was not fine. She was choosing to function, which is a different thing. "Marcus," he said. "The federal contacts. What's the timeline?" Carol reached her contact at the DOJ at 5 a.m. "They're reviewing the documentation now. She says—" He paused. There was muffled talking on his end. "She says if the digital forensics hold up, they can issue a preservation order by 9. Maybe earlier. That freezes the SEC submission as evidence rather than an active filing. And Crosswell. If they can tie him to the document through financial transactions and the communication record, they can bring him in for questioning." Marcus paused. "Gavin, can they tie him?" Petra says yes. "Then we're in a foot race." Marcus's voice tightened. "What do I do about the 2 men in Seaport?" "Call the local police. File a report about suspicious activity at the motel. Don't mention my name or Naomi's. Just get police presence in the area." "That slows them, but doesn't stop them." "I know." Gavin looked at the high dark ceiling. "It buys us until 9. He hung up. He sat with his hands on the laptop. Outside the cannery walls, the first gray of pre-dawn was beginning to push against the windows high up in the wall, not enough to see by, just enough to know that morning was coming. Naomi said, "2 men." "Yes." "Connected to the person who's been doing all of this?" "Yes." She absorbed that. She turned the flashlight over in her hands once. "And if your attorney gets the federal people moving before 9 a.m., then it becomes a criminal matter and Crosswell loses his leverage. And if they don't move before 9, he looked at her, then we deal with whatever comes next. That's not an answer. "No," he said, "it's not." She was quiet. Then she said, "Our daughter." He stilled. "If it's a girl," she said. "I've been thinking it's a girl. I don't know why. I just—" She stopped. "I've been thinking about her name." He didn't trust his voice for a moment. He waited until he did. "What name?" "I haven't decided." She looked at the windows where the gray was coming. "I needed you to help decide." He reached into his jacket pocket. He took out the ultrasound picture. He held it out to her. She took it. She looked at it in the thin beam of the flashlight. Her face did something complicated and quiet and private. "I've been carrying it since the day you left," he said. She didn't answer. She held the picture. They sat in the cold dark of the cannery while the sky outside began its slow shift from black to gray, and Gavin's phone cycled through calls from Carol and Marcus and Petra, and he answered each one and spoke in low, terse sentences and relayed what was needed, and Naomi sat beside him and didn't leave and didn't sleep and didn't say much but was there, which was the only thing that was making the next few hours feel survivable. At 7:12 a.m., Carol called with a tone in her voice that was as close to urgency as Carol Weston got. "The DOJ forensics team validated Petra's documentation 40 minutes ago," she said. "The access logs are clean, the financial traces are solid, and they have 2 prior filings from Crosswell's operating territory that show a similar pattern of corporate interference." She paused. "They're going to move." "How soon?" "Preservation order by 8. Crosswell's people will receive formal inquiry notification by 8:30. Another pause. "That doesn't mean he stops. It means anything he does from that point becomes evidence." "Does he know?" "He will," she said. "Probably through his own legal team in the next hour. These things get around." A short pause. "Gavin, when he finds out, his window for pressure closes and his incentive to act impulsively goes up. Do you understand what I'm telling you? He did. He stood up from the pallet. He moved to the far end of the cannery, close to the east wall, and looked up at a high window where the gray dawn was now fully present. How long between now and the formal notification to his legal team? Maybe 40 minutes. Maybe less. 40 minutes. He turned. Naomi was watching him from across the dim space, the flashlight angled down now, her face in half shadow, the ultrasound picture in her hand. He heard it before he understood what it was. A sound at the far end of the building, the south end, near the loading doors. Not the wind, not settling metal. Something with weight and purpose behind it, moving against a door that was not quite latched. He looked at Naomi. She'd heard it too. Her body had gone still with the specific stillness of someone whose instincts had fired before their brain caught up. He crossed to her in 7 steps. He took her arm, not pulling, guiding. "East side," he said. "There's an exit near the corner." Diane said, "I know where it is," she said. Her voice was level. The sound again, louder, the unmistakable grind of a heavy door being pushed from outside. They moved. The east exit was 70 feet away through the dark interior, past rows of rusted metal shelving and the hulks of old equipment that had been left when the cannery closed, and Gavin had his phone in his hand and was dialing Marcus before they'd covered 20 feet. The call connected. He didn't say hello. "They're at the cannery," he said. "South doors. I'm calling local PD right now. How fast can they get here?" A fraction of a pause that felt enormous. 7 minutes, maybe 6. "Move," Gavin said, to Marcus and to himself, and to Naomi, who was already moving, who was not waiting for him to lead, but was navigating the dark space with the flashlight cutting a beam ahead of them. And he stayed a step behind her, between her and the sound that was now clearly the sound of the south loading door opening, metal screaming on its track. She hit the east exit at a run. The door gave. It was not locked from the inside, just stiff, and she hit it with her shoulder, and it opened into the cold dawn air, and they came out into a narrow service lane behind the cannery, concrete and old weeds, and the smell of salt water close, the sky fully gray now and lightning fast, and Gavin pulled the door shut behind them, and they ran. Not far. The lane terminated 30 meters east at a chain-link fence with a gap at the bottom, the gap Diane had mentioned, and Naomi went through it first, barely breaking stride, and he followed and came up on the other side onto a gravel lot, and they kept moving east toward the water because east was away from the south entrance and away from wherever the men had come from. He heard the exit door they'd come through hit the wall behind them. He didn't look back. He ran. His phone in his hand, Marcus still on the line, and he said between breaths, "East of the cannery, the waterfront." "PD is 4 minutes out," Marcus said. "Stay on the line." The gravel lot gave way to a wooden boardwalk, weathered and uneven, and beyond it the harbor, gray water in the gray morning, the smell of it everywhere now, salt and diesel and cold. He caught up to Naomi at the edge of the boardwalk and they stopped, both breathing hard, and he turned and looked back. 2 figures at the far end of the gravel lot, walking fast, not running, the deliberate pace of men who knew they had time and didn't need to run because there was nowhere left to go. Gavin counted the distance. 70 meters. Maybe less. 4 minutes. Naomi's hand found his arm. Not for support. The grip of someone who was present and not leaving. He looked at her. She was breathing hard, hair pushed back by the run. The ultrasound picture somehow still in her other hand, crumpled slightly at the corner. She was looking at the 2 men coming across the lot. Her jaw was set. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. He looked back at the men. He put himself squarely between them and Naomi, and he stood there on the weathered boardwalk above the harbor in the gray early light with his phone to his ear and Marcus's voice saying, 2 minutes, they're 2 minutes out. And he thought about everything that had been taken and manufactured and weaponized over 8 months to bring them to this specific cold morning on a dock in a town he'd never been to, and he felt the fear of it and the fury of it simultaneously, and he did not move. The 2 men stopped 15 meters away. The taller one had his hand inside his jacket. "Mr. Mercer," he said. His voice was flat, neutral, the voice of professional intermediaries who have been paid to deliver messages. "Mr. Crosswell would like to resolve this before the morning becomes complicated." Gavin looked at him. "Mr. Crosswell's morning," he said, "is already complicated." His phone buzzed. A text from Carol Weston. 2 words. Order signed. He held up the phone so they could see the screen without being able to read it. The preservation order went through 8 minutes ago, he said. Everything on that server is now federal evidence. The SEC filing is frozen pending investigation. He watched them. The taller man's expression did not change. The other one glanced sideways. Any action you take on this boardwalk in the next 90 seconds is recorded, witnessed, and adds to an already substantial federal case. He paused. So, before this morning becomes more complicated than it already is, you should probably call your employer. Somewhere behind him, distant but closing, the sound of a siren. The two men looked at each other. The taller one took his hand out of his jacket, empty, and they both took 2 steps back. And then the police cruiser turned the corner at the far end of the lot, its lights going, and the morning cracked open with the noise of it, blue and red washing over the weathered buildings and the gravel and the gray water. And Gavin exhaled, one long exhale, and felt Naomi's hand tighten on his arm, not letting go. The police cruiser stopped 20 feet from the two men, and for a moment nobody moved. The blue and red light swept across the gravel lot in slow rotations, catching the water behind the boardwalk and throwing it back in fragments. One officer got out, hand on his belt, not drawing, just present. The deliberate presence of law enforcement that doesn't need to escalate because the situation has already changed shape. The taller man had both hands visible now. The other one had stepped back a full pace and was looking at his phone with the focused attention of someone receiving instructions. Gavin watched them. The taller man said something quiet to the other. Then he looked at Gavin across the 15 meters of gravel and weathered wood, and the look was not threatening and not defeated. It was the look of a professional who has received new information and is updating accordingly. He nodded once, a small, almost courteous gesture, and then both men turned and walked back the way they'd come, unhurried, past the arriving officer who tracked them with his eyes, and then looked at Gavin. "Sir, we got a call about suspicious activity in this area." "2 individuals," Gavin said. "They were on private property without authorization. They're leaving now." He paused. "I'd appreciate if you stayed in the area for the next hour." The officer looked at Naomi, at Gavin, at the phone still in Gavin's hand. "You need medical attention, either of you?" "No," Naomi said. Her voice was steady. The steadiness that had been costing her something all morning was still holding. The officer nodded. He got back in his car but didn't leave. He pulled it to the edge of the lot and sat there with the engine running. Gavin looked at the cruiser and felt something release in his chest that had been locked tight since the moment he'd heard the cannery door. He looked at Naomi. She was looking at the water. "It's cold," she said. "Yes." "I want coffee." She turned from the water. "And I want to sit somewhere warm, and I want you to tell me what happens next. The actual next thing, not the version where you make it sound manageable." He almost said something. He stopped himself. "Okay," he said. They walked back toward town in the early light, the officer's cruiser following at a distance, and Gavin called Marcus and told him the men had withdrawn, and Carol and told her the situation was stable, and Petra and told her to document everything from overnight and send it to Carol's federal contact immediately. 3 calls, back-to-back, brief and precise, and Naomi walked beside him with her hands in the front pocket of his sweatshirt and didn't ask him to stop. She understood that this was what the next phase looked like. The machinery of consequence beginning to run. They found a diner 2 blocks from the harbor that opened at 6. Plastic booths, fluorescent light, a woman behind the counter who refilled coffee without being asked. The normalcy of it was almost disorienting. Menus laminated and sticky at the corners. A television on a shelf in the corner, running local news with the sound off, the smell of bacon grease and coffee, and something sweet from the kitchen. They sat across from each other. Naomi wrapped both hands around her coffee mug and looked at him over the rim and said, "Tell me." He told her the actual next thing. The preservation order meant the SEC filing was frozen as evidence, which meant no active fraud investigation against him would proceed while the federal review was ongoing. Crosswell's legal team had been notified by 8:30, which meant Crosswell himself knew by 9, which meant the 2 men on the boardwalk had been his last direct move before the legal walls closed in. The documentation Petra had assembled, the server access logs, the financial traces through Arlen's strategic group, the calendar manipulations, the intercepted emails, the forged digital signature, was in the hands of a DOJ contact who had, according to Carol, described it as substantial. Substantial was a legal word that meant the word Gavin actually needed Carol to say wouldn't come until there was more process behind it, but substantial was not nothing. And Crosswell himself, Naomi said. He just, waits. His attorneys will advise him to cooperate with the inquiry, Gavin said, which means cooperating selectively and slowly. These things take, he stopped. Time, she said. Yes. She was quiet. She drank her coffee. Outside, the gray morning was becoming something lighter, not quite sun, but the particular mid-morning brightness of an overcast coastal day, the kind that makes everything look slightly washed out and honest. And Vanessa, Naomi said. The name was flat in her mouth, not heated, just stated, the way you say the name of something you want to look at clearly. She hasn't been located yet. She left the building voluntarily yesterday morning and hasn't returned. She knows she's exposed. Yes. Naomi set down her mug. She turned it slightly on the table, a small, precise movement, just to give her hand something to do. She came to me once, she said, in the lobby of your building, about 4 months ago. I was dropping something off. She was very warm. She asked if I was keeping well, asked how we were doing. She paused. I thought she was just being professional. I thought she was the kind of efficient, personable person you hire when you want someone good at everything. A short exhale. She was taking inventory. Yes, Gavin said. She knew what she was doing to us, and she looked at me in the lobby, and she... Naomi stopped. She pressed her thumb against the handle of the mug. I'm not going to pretend I'm not angry about that. You shouldn't pretend. I'm angry at her, and I'm angry at... She looked at him, direct, unflinching. I'm angry at you too. I want to say that clearly. I know. Not for the thing I thought you did, for the thing you actually did. She held his eyes. You stopped seeing me. Not because of her. Before her. You stopped checking in. You stopped noticing that I was trying. She picked up the coffee again. She found the gap and built in it, yes, but the gap was already there. He didn't look away. He didn't offer anything in defense, because there wasn't anything in defense, and she wasn't wrong. Yes, he said. It was. She nodded once. She looked out the window. The baby, she said. Thursday's appointment. I was going to go alone if you... I'll be there, he said. Carol Weston. Will have everything she needs from me before Thursday morning. He paused. I will be there. She looked at him for a long moment, measuring something she didn't name out loud. Then she picked up the menu and looked at it and said, I want eggs. I haven't wanted eggs in 6 weeks, and I suddenly want eggs. He picked up his own menu. Eggs, he said. They drove back to the city that afternoon. Not together at first. Diane came to the diner and sat with them for an hour, and fed them both more coffee and did not say anything that required a response, which was a specific kind of generosity. Then Naomi said she was going to pack her things, and Gavin should go back for his rental car, and they would drive separately and figure out the rest from there. He said, okay. He drove the 3 hours back with the radio on this time, news and traffic, and the ordinary machinery of the world going about its business. And he thought about the diner conversation, and the boardwalk, and the cannery, and a staircase at 2 a.m. in a house that smelled like paint and coffee. And he thought about Naomi saying, I just miss you, in an email that had been stolen from between them and weaponized as silence. He thought about how much silence had been manufactured, how much of what he'd believed was absence had actually been interference, and how much of it, the part that mattered, the part that was actually on him, had been real. Both things were true. That was the part he hadn't fully absorbed until the diner. The trap had been real, and the gap the trap was built in had also been real. Crosswell hadn't invented the distance between him and Naomi. He'd measured it, mapped it, and built inside it with the cold efficiency of a man who did this professionally, which meant the work of the next months wasn't only legal, it was the other kind. The slower, harder kind that didn't have a filing deadline or a federal contact or a cybersecurity firm to call. I was back in the city by 4 p.m. Carol Weston's office was on the 31st floor of a building on Lexington Glass and Steel, the kind of lobby where sound gets swallowed. He went up and she met him at the elevator in a dark blazer and reading glasses pushed up on her head and the expression of someone who has been working without stop since 5 a.m. and is not complaining about it because complaining about it would cost time. "Sit down," she said. He sat. She sat across from him and put a tablet on the table and walked him through it methodically. The preservation order was in effect. The DOJ forensic team had validated the server access logs and confirmed the digital signature on the fraudulent filing had been generated through a credential spoofing method traceable to tools consistent with those used in 2 prior corporate interference cases, both of which involved entities in Crosswell's operating sphere. The financial trail connecting Vanessa Hale to Meridian Capital Advisors through Arlen Strategic Group was being subpoenaed as of this afternoon. Crosswell's attorneys contacted the DOJ at 10:15 this morning, Carol said. They're using the word cooperation, which in practice means they're trying to control the pace. Can they? They can slow it. They can't stop it. The documentation is too clean. She tapped the tablet. Petrovos is good. I'd like to retain her for our side if you're amenable. Whatever she needs. Carol nodded. She took off her reading glasses and set them on the table. The gesture was the closest she came to a pause. Gavin, the board. He waited. Victor Haynes called an emergency session this morning before the preservation order was public knowledge. She looked at him evenly. They voted to suspend your executive authority pending the outcome of federal inquiry. He absorbed that. They can do that, he said. It wasn't a question. He knew the bylaws. They can, Carol said. And they did. The suspension is technically temporary, pending review, but the language they used gives them significant discretion about what pending review means in practice. She paused. Victor moved quickly. Victor has been waiting for something to move quickly about for 3 years. Probably. Carol's voice was precise and absent of judgment. What would you like to do about it? He thought about that. He thought about 43 floors and a boardroom with east-facing windows and 7 people around an oval table, and he thought about stock prices and board language and the word interim appearing next to words like leadership and structure. Nothing yet, he said. Let the federal process move. If the documentation holds, it will hold. Then the premise for the suspension dissolves on its own. He paused. Fighting it before then turns this into a governance story. I'd rather it stays what it is. Carol looked at him for a moment. That's a patient read. I've been impatient for a year, he said. Look where it got me. She picked her reading glasses back up, put them on, looked at the tablet. Vanessa Hale, she said. She surfaced this afternoon. Her attorney contacted federal investigators at 2 p.m. She's cooperating. Something shifted in the room. Full cooperation? Full. Carol's voice was flat. She's providing testimony, communications, and financial records related to her engagement with Meridian Capital Advisors. Her attorney is negotiating terms. A pause. She was recruited 14 months ago, 2 weeks before she applied for the position at your company. She was given a specific brief and a payment structure tied to milestones. Gavin sat with that. Milestones. Like a project plan. Like a timeline with deliverables and performance metrics. He thought about 14 months of someone sitting across from him every day, handling his schedule, his communications, his professional life, while executing a project plan designed to dismantle him. What were the milestones, he said. Carol looked at him. You don't need to know that right now. Carol, she exhaled. Creating documented evidence of marital infidelity, isolating the CEO from personal support structures, generating board-level doubt about executive judgment, and, she paused, ensuring the fraudulent SEC filing was in place before a targeted press event that would have made his resignation under pressure appear voluntary. Gavin was quiet for a moment. There was going to be a press event. Next week. Carol's voice was careful. An anonymous source had already been in contact with 2 journalists about what was being characterized as voluntary disclosure of accounting irregularities by senior management. The filing would have already been in the public record. You would have appeared to be getting ahead of something you'd actually submitted. The architecture of it. The complete careful architecture of it. Not just the rumors or the photographs or the manufactured distance from Naomi. All of it feeding into a single designed outcome. A CEO who appeared to have committed fraud and who, facing the collapse of his marriage and his board's confidence, quietly stepped down and accepted a buyout as the least damaging exit. Crosswell would have acquired Mercer Dynamics at crisis pricing, below half its value, in what would have looked from the outside like a distressed CEO making the responsible decision. It was, Gavin thought, actually impressive in its construction, in the way that something terrible can be impressive if you look at it purely as engineering. They didn't count on the cybersecurity review, Carol said, and they didn't count on you driving to Seaport instead of taking Crosswell's call. They didn't count on Naomi, he said. Carol looked at him, a small, precise pause. No, she said. I don't think they did. Damien Crosswell was brought in for federal questioning on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after the boardwalk. Gavin didn't watch it happen. He was in an exam room with Naomi and Dr. Patel, listening to a heartbeat on a monitor that was faster and stronger than he'd expected. This small, determined percussion that filled the room and made Naomi put her hand over her mouth and made Gavin grip the edge of the exam table with both hands, because there was nothing else to do with the feeling. He'd rescheduled 2 calls to be there. He did not think about them once. Dr. Patel said, "Strong heartbeat. Everything looks right on schedule." Naomi let out a breath that she seemed to have been holding for some time, not just since the exam started. Gavin looked at the monitor and at Naomi's face and at the slight curve of movement visible in the image, and he thought about a yellow envelope on a desk and a morning that had seemed like the end of everything and understood, in a way that didn't require language, that the distance between that morning and this one had been the most important distance he'd ever crossed. In the parking structure afterward, before they got in their respective cars, they were still living separately. That was the honest answer to where things stood. Him in the apartment, her at her sister Brenda's, figuring it out in the daylight like adults. Naomi stopped beside her car and turned to him. She was moving, she said. On the monitor. Did you see? I saw. She does that, Naomi said. I've been feeling it for 2 weeks. Just small things, like she's getting comfortable. He didn't say anything. He just looked at her. She looked back. We still have a lot of work to do, she said. You and me, the regular kind. The kind that isn't corporate espionage and federal investigations. I know. I'm not ready to say everything's fine. I'm not asking you to. She held his eyes. But I'm here, she said. I want to say that clearly too. I'm here. He nodded. He felt the weight of it, not as a burden, as something real, solid, the kind of thing you can stand on. I'll call you tonight, he said. Okay, she said. She got in her car. He stood in the parking structure after she drove out and just breathed for a moment. Cold concrete and exhaust and the sound of the city. He breathed it in. He stood there. Then he got in his car and drove. Vanessa Hale's cooperation agreement was finalized 6 weeks after the boardwalk. In exchange for full testimony and documentary evidence against Damien Crosswell and Meridian Capital Advisors, she received a reduced charge on 2 of the 7 counts filed against her. Evidence tampering and corporate espionage carried the heavier sentences, and those stood. Her attorney argued for mitigation based on financial coercion, that she'd been recruited during a period of professional vulnerability and offered money she'd needed badly enough to make a choice she'd known was wrong. The judge listened. The judge weighed it. The judge gave her 4 years. It was not a light sentence. It was not a heavy one. It was the kind of sentence that sits in the middle of something terrible and says, this mattered, and you knew it mattered, and there are consequences for things that matter. Gavin didn't attend the sentencing. He read about it the following morning at his kitchen table. Coffee. He actually drank this time, the apartment quiet around him. He read it twice and felt nothing simple. What he felt was complicated and layered and not particularly satisfying, which is how the end of something terrible usually feels. Not like victory, just like the removal of a weight you'd gotten so used to carrying, you'd almost forgotten what it was like to stand without it. Damien Crosswell's legal process was longer and louder and more expensive and generated significantly more press coverage, because men like Damien Crosswell do not go quietly into legal consequence. They fight, and they appeal, and they produce counter-narratives, and they hire the best attorneys available, and they create enough procedural turbulence that by the time resolution comes, it feels almost academic. The resolution, when it came, was not academic. 3 counts of federal fraud. 2 counts of conspiracy to commit corporate espionage. 1 count directly related to the submission of falsified documents to a federal regulatory body under a false credential. His attorneys negotiated some of the surrounding charges down, but could not touch the core counts because the documentation was, as Carol Weston had said from the beginning, too clean. He lost his primary holding company to shareholder litigation that began within weeks of the federal charges becoming public. The litigation was ugly and protracted, but the shareholders had been watching a man whose second most expensive project, after the Mercer operation, turned out to be a separate influence campaign in a different sector that unraveled when investigators started pulling the threads. The shareholder suits compounded each other. By the time the criminal convictions were finalized, Croswell's empire was in the process of being dismantled in about 7 different venues simultaneously. Gavin followed it from a distance. He did not feel satisfaction. He felt the particular exhaustion of a person who has survived something and is now primarily interested in what comes next. The board reinstated his executive authority 8 weeks after the suspension, once the federal inquiry exonerated him of any involvement in the fraudulent filing. Victor Haynes delivered the notification in person, which Gavin suspected was less about respect and more about Victor's need to be in the room when the balance of power reestablished itself. Victor sat across from him in the same boardroom, the east-facing windows with the same view. He was composed and precise and said the right things in the right order, and when he finished, he folded his hands on the table and said, "I moved quickly." "Yes," Gavin said. "I'm not going to tell you I was wrong to move quickly. Given the information available at the time, you were doing your job," Gavin said. "I know." Victor looked at him for a moment. Something shifted slightly in the older man's face. Not warmth exactly, but something in the direction of recognition. "You look different," he said. "I've had a difficult few months." "Yes." Victor paused. "We all have." He stood. He picked up his folder. At the door he stopped, with his hand on the frame, the same posture Marcus had used in this same office in what felt like a different era. "The company is intact," he said. "Battered, but intact. What you want to do with it now is your call." He left. Gavin sat alone in the boardroom for a few minutes. He looked at the windows, the city below going about its morning. He thought about what Victor had said. What you want to do with it now. He thought about blind loyalty. The phrase from the early press coverage, someone describing the company culture as built on blind loyalty to executive leadership, meaning him, meaning the kind of institutional deference that had made it possible for Vanessa to operate inside the company for 14 months with no one raising a flag. The cameras she'd adjusted, the emails she'd intercepted, the quiet, incremental manipulation that required not just her own skill, but the passive cooperation of a culture that had learned not to question. He had built that culture. Not intentionally, not maliciously, but through the accumulation of years of being someone whose judgment was rarely challenged, and whose office was a place people approached carefully. He pulled out a legal pad. He started writing. Not a press strategy, not a board presentation, just a list, the things he wanted to change. Not because someone was watching or because the optics required it, but because he'd spent 3 months looking at what his inattention had cost, and he was not interested in repeating the experiment. The list was not particularly dramatic. It was mostly ordinary. Regular structured communication, open calendar auditing, anonymous reporting channels for staff concerns. A standing policy that executive relationships would be reviewed annually by a compliance officer with no reporting line to the CEO. Small mechanical things that would not have prevented a sophisticated external operation, but would have made the internal environment significantly less exploitable. He wrote for 40 minutes. Then he picked up his phone and called Naomi. She answered on the 3rd ring. "How'd it go?" "Victor was Victor," he said. "I'm reinstated." "Okay." A pause. "How do you feel?" He thought about it honestly. "Ready to do something different," he said. "Or the same things differently. I haven't figured out the language yet." "You don't need language," she said. "You just need to do it." He smiled. It was the first time in about 2 months that smiling had felt like something other than performance. "Are you home tonight?" He still said home for Brenda's, which was imprecise, but the alternative was Brenda's, which sounded like a restaurant. "I'll be home by 6, she said. "Are you coming over?" "If that's all right. I'll make dinner." "You don't have to." "I want to," she said. "I've been wanting to cook for 3 weeks. The baby wants pasta. I'm choosing to believe that." A pause. "Come at 7. Don't be late." "I won't be late," he said. She hung up. He sat in the boardroom a moment longer, then he picked up the legal pad and his jacket, and he walked out. Their daughter was born on a Tuesday in early spring at 6:42 in the morning in a delivery room that smelled like clean plastic and antiseptic, and the particular charged air of a room where something enormous is happening at ordinary speed. Gavin was there. He had been there since 2 in the morning when Naomi had called him in a voice that was completely level and said, "It's time. Don't speed." He had sped. He arrived before she did, which she pointed out when she came through the automatic doors with Brenda beside her, and he said he'd driven carefully but perhaps quickly, and she looked at him and said, "I told you not to speed," in the exact tone that meant she was glad he'd arrived first. The labor was 9 hours. Not clean, not easy, not the way things look in a room where everyone knows what they're doing and is very kind but cannot actually take the weight of it for you. Naomi labored with the same quality he'd seen in her on a boardwalk in the early morning, with 2 men walking across a gravel lot, present, determined, and unwilling to pretend anything was less than it was. He held her hand. He did not say the wrong things because he had learned in the preceding months the particular value of not filling silence with words that are more about the speaker's comfort than the listener's need. He was there, and he was quiet, and when she needed him to do something specific, she told him, and he did it. At 6:42, their daughter arrived. The sound she made, that first sound, that announcement of presence, went through Gavin like something physical, like current. The doctor put her on Naomi's chest, and Naomi's face did something he had no language for. Her whole face. The exhaustion and the overwhelming and the enormous specific love all happening at once, visible and unguarded in a way he had not seen from her in years. And he thought, this is what she looks like when she's not protecting herself. This is what she looks like when there's nothing between her and what she feels. He wanted to earn that. Not as a project, not as a goal with milestones, just as the ongoing ordinary work of being someone she didn't need to protect herself from. A nurse appeared at his elbow and asked if he wanted to hold her, and he looked at Naomi and Naomi looked at him and nodded, and the nurse transferred the small wrapped weight into his arms. He had held babies before. His sister's children, friends' children. He knew the mechanics of it. This was entirely different. She was very small and very warm, and she was moving. Small, restless movements. The adjusting of a person who had just arrived somewhere and wasn't quite settled yet. Her eyes were dark and unfocused, and she wrinkled her face at the light. She smelled like something new. He stood in the middle of the delivery room holding her and thought about a yellow envelope on a desk, and a door closing, and a train going south, and a cannery at dawn, and a boardwalk, and a staircase at 2 in the morning, and 9 months of the hardest thing he had ever done that was not a business problem, not a legal problem, not a problem that could be solved by being better at his job. The hardest thing was simpler than any of that. It was just showing up, specifically to the right things, at the right time, for the right reasons. He looked at Naomi over the small wrapped head of their daughter. She was watching him with the kind of tiredness that has come through something and reached the other side. Not happy exactly. Deeper than happy. The way a person looks when something real has happened and they're in it and they know they're in it. "What do you think?" she said. About her name. He looked down at the face of his daughter, who was doing something that might have been a squint or might have been a decision. He thought about what Naomi had said in the cannery, in the dark, with the ultrasound picture in her hand. "I've been thinking it's a girl. I've been thinking about her name. I needed you to help decide." "Whatever you choose," he said, "I'll spend the rest of my life making sure she knows where it came from." Naomi was quiet for a moment. "May," she said. "I want to call her May." He looked at her, then at May. May, who was small and warm and new and had arrived on a Tuesday in early spring into a world that was imperfect and complicated and had recently tried quite hard to come apart at the seams and had not quite managed it. "May," he said. The name fit the room. Fit the morning. Fit the light coming in through the window above the bed, the ordinary early spring light of a city going about its day, indifferent to the enormous ordinary miracle happening in a room on the 4th floor. He sat in the chair beside the bed and held his daughter and his wife dozed in the thin sleep of the genuinely exhausted, and the room was quiet. And outside the city moved, and Gavin held May against his chest and thought about nothing in particular and everything at once. Later, weeks later, months later, people would ask him, in various ways, what had changed, what the experience had done to him, whether he ran the company differently, whether the marriage was different, whether he was different. He never found a clean answer. The honest answer was not clean. What he knew was this: he had spent years building things, companies, strategies, systems, the kind of structures that could withstand pressure and outlast competition. He had been very good at it. He had believed, without quite saying it to himself, that building things was the primary activity of a life worth examining. He now understood that the most important thing he had ever built had nearly collapsed because he'd been looking at everything else, and that the rebuilding, not the dramatic arc of it, not the boardwalk and the cannery and the federal documentation, but the daily, undramatic, ongoing work of being present, was not a thing you finished. It was a thing you chose, repeatedly, in the small decisions that didn't feel like decisions because they weren't large enough to name. Attending appointments, answering calls, coming home when you said you would, reading the email when it arrived, looking up. May moved in his arms. She made a small sound that was not quite contentment and not quite complaint. He adjusted his hold slightly, and she settled. He looked at Naomi sleeping. He thought, I will not waste this. Not as a vow, not as a declaration, just as a fact, quiet and private, belonging to no one but the room. He held his daughter until the morning finished arriving, and the city outside the window went fully into its day, and the fluorescent lights in the corridor hummed their ordinary hum. And somewhere in the world, Damien Crosswell was answering to consequences, and Vanessa Hale was serving out her years, and Victor Haynes was running a board meeting, and the stock ticker was doing what stock tickers do, and none of it, not a single piece of it, was the most important thing in the room. The most important thing in the room was 4 days old and had her mother's jaw and her father's stubbornness and the whole long rest of her life still ahead of her, unmarked and unhurried, waiting to be lived.